We're going to go ahead and get started. We're in the book of Joshua, chapter 6, and we've been in this book now for about 6 weeks. And this is one of the most exciting chapters in the whole book of Joshua because we're going to be talking about the Battle of Jericho. I remember as a kid even singing about the Battle of Jericho. Joshua fought the Battle of Jericho. So he fit it. Yes, that's correct. So we're going to go ahead and get started here, and I'm going to read just a few verses at a time. I'll let you know ahead of time what I'm going to read. I'm going to read the first 5 verses, and then we're going to talk about them for a little while. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to read the first 5 verses. Now Jericho was securely shut up because of the children of Israel. None went out and none came in. And the Lord said to Joshua, "See." Sometimes you have to see before you see. You know what I'm talking about? That's a statement of faith. He says, "See, I have given Jericho into your hand, its king and the mighty men of valor. You shall march around the city, all your men of war. You shall go all around the city once. This you shall do for 6 days, and 7 priests shall bear 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark. But the 7th day you shall march around the city 7 times, and the priests shall blow the trumpets. And it shall come to pass, when they make a long blast with the ram's horn, and when you hear the sound of the trumpet, that all the people shall shout with a great shout. Then the wall of the city will fall down flat, and the people shall go up, every man straight before him." So we're talking about the battle plan, and so many times we have said that the book of Jericho, from a strictly strategic military standpoint, doesn't always make sense from man's point of view. But God's in control. God's in charge. He's the one calling the shots. Even in our lives, if we'll be obedient to Him, sometimes He does maybe ask us to do things that may not seem the right way to do things. But we know if we're following after the Lord that He's going to take care of us. So there's a whole lot of obedience that we're going to see in this from the children of Israel. And they don't immediately go into battle with Jericho, although from a strategic standpoint, the people are afraid, the people are terrified. They know that God has already given the land and the city of Jericho to the Israelites, and so we see this going on. So the city was securely shut up, is what it tells us. It was on full alert. There's from a human perspective, as we talked about, it's going to be very difficult, if not an impossible battle, just because of the fortifications of the city. When you begin to talk about the fortifications of the city, it's been a while since I've looked at this, but the walls were something like 20 feet in depth. Houses literally set on top of the walls of the city. And it surrounded the whole city from the human standpoint, making it an impenetrable force. But yet we know that God's with them. So from God's perspective, however, so we've talked about man's perspective, but from God's perspective, the battle was already over. Because God had told Joshua, "I have given." That's a past tense statement. I've already given it to you. It's in your hand. And so we see from God's perspective that it's already done. It's all they have to do is be obedient to the Lord, and they're going to see the results. So up to this point, everything was kind of a preliminary or preparatory. Now the task lies before them to be faced and to be tackled. The Canaanites must be dispossessed of Israel and in order to inherit what God has called them to do. So Jericho was not really a large city, but it was an important fortress, and it was the first city that the Israelites would come upon, and the most important from the standpoint that it was going to be the most difficult from a human standpoint. So rather than taking on a small enemy, like sometimes we might do if we were going to go into battle, and then building our way up to the largest force, here God has them take on the biggest, baddest city, the biggest giant, if you will, like David did. And so they're taking on this city. So if Israel could defeat Jericho, then they could defeat anything in Canaan. And so we see they're going to advance forward. Now, here's where it gets really amazing, is that God doesn't tell them to go storm the gates of the city. He doesn't tell them to climb over the walls, but what he does say is simply march around the city. So from a military standpoint, that doesn't make a lot of sense, but it's what God is requiring them, a total obedience to him, and it required a whole lot of faith. Now, if you can imagine, here's these great big tall walls. I think they said they were 20 feet tall and 20 feet in depth, if I remember reading it correctly. And the people can look over and see the Israelites marching around the city. That leaves them in a position of being very vulnerable. But they're doing this, so which is just going to require a lot of faith, and it required faith from the people of the nation to follow Joshua. Here, they had been led out by Moses. Remember everything Moses had done, and now they're following after Joshua. And God has already said that this day I'm going to magnify you in the sight of the people. So we see all of this going on. And so why would God ask them to do this whenever he could have just taken care of it by himself? He could have flattened the city. He could have done all kinds of things, but why would he want the people to do that? To show they had faith, to show obedience, right? All of those things. So God many times will tell us things that we should do, and it just simply requires obedience and faith. The Bible even tells us that obedience is better than sacrifice, right? And as many times I tell people that one of the highest forms of worship is simply obedience, because God would rather have obedience than any kind of sacrifice, whether it's worship or whatever. Obviously, when we're being obedient, we are worshiping God, because we're exalting him and saying, whatever you say to do, God, I'm going to do it, right? So it's important. So Joshua has the priest, tells the priest what they're to do, and it's unusual. Normally the priest didn't follow them into battle, but this time they're to carry the Ark of the Covenant into battle with them. Which is very interesting, because when they crossed the Jordan, they carried the Ark of the Covenant. Now as they're going into the first battle, you're going to see the priest blowing the trumpets. You're going to see the Ark of the Covenant, and then you're going to see the fighters or the warriors who are also in this procession. So they take up the Ark of the Covenant. So all the time that they're preparing. Now, I'm going to say this ahead of time, but we know that they didn't march around the city just one time the first day and God gave them the city, right? There was obedience over a long term. And there's some things that we can learn from this whole process that will help us in our life. How many ever prayed one time and God just didn't move? Felt like he didn't move. Maybe felt like it didn't even hear you. Felt like, your prayers were going up to a brass ceiling. Well, there's some consistency and some things that go along with this story that I think will help us as we learn how to be obedient to the Lord. So, the other thing that we'll see that Joshua tells the people is, don't say a word until I tell you to. And I know I've preached about this before, but why was that so important for the people not to say anything? That's good. Bill said sometimes once you start a conversation, there's a lot of mumbling or talk in the background that's going on. So, um, as I said before, when God gives us a plan, sometimes it doesn't make sense to man in man's eyes. And so, if they would have begun to talk, they may lead to that place that Bill's talking about where they're like, this doesn't make sense. And they're talking and they're minimizing what God has told them to do. So it's very important for them to remain quiet. The other reason is that I believe Joshua was very, the Lord told him to do this, but Joshua was very intent because if you remember, when the 12 spies were sent in and God didn't allow them to go in because they were disobedient and unfaithful. Well, only two people spoke the right words, Joshua and Caleb, who said, God's already given it to us. We can take this. We've got this, guys. But the rest of the people convinced the nation of Israel not to go in at all. So the power of the spoken word, as we say things, many times we can just kind of snidely say things. Well, I don't think that's the right way to do it. And sometimes, it'll lead people to not follow the leader or to not follow what really God's called the people to do. So it's very important. And I don't believe that Joshua or Caleb, either one, were willing to give up finally making it to the promised land. I can imagine as they're walking around and somebody might start to say something, they'd probably look at them like, don't you run my chance to go into the promised land, to make this ours. And so it's very important. So they're circling the city on the first day, going around it once. And as the people saw the Israelites marching around the city, I believe they probably had a sense of awe and wonder. Like, what is going on here? We don't understand this. No one's ever tried to come against this city in this manner in particular. So imagine the people of Jericho, their confusion, their concern, their worry. And so it took a lot of courage for Israel to do this because they're wide open to attack. It would have been easy for them to be attacked because the people were on a higher position and could have shot arrows, could have done all kinds of things, but we know, of course, that they didn't, and God was protecting them. So not only did it take courage, so these are some of the things that we see when God tells us to do something, sometimes it takes courage, right? We got to do it even when it doesn't make sense, even when it seems like the enemy might have an advantage over us. We still need to have the courage that God will give to us. But not only did it take courage, it took endurance. Because the first day, they marched around the city. The second day, they marched around the city. The third day, marching around the city. Until the seventh day, and then they march around the city 7 times, right? So it took a lot of endurance to continue to do what God told them to do. This so many times we think that God has called us to do something amazing, something that some grand feat that the Lord has called us to do. And when we see this, all God's doing is saying, hey, just keep marching. I'm going to do it. It's going to be my timing, and it's going to happen whenever I say it's going to happen. But they were just marching. They'd march around the city. They'd go back to camp. Now, remember where camp was? Where? Gilgal, right? So when they go back to camp, they're reminded of the greatness of God and how God already helped them to get over the Jordan River, all kinds of things. They're reminded here how faithful that God has been. So they're traveling, they're going around the city, and then they're going back and saying, okay, let me remind myself one more time that God did this before, and he can do another miracle again. So I think it's very important that we understand how their mindset. So let's look at, let's look at verses 8 through 14. And I've talked about some of this already, but let's read that. Actually, I stopped at verse 5, so we'll read verses 6 through 14. Then Joshua the son of Nun called the priests and said to them, "Take up the ark of the covenant. Let the priests bear 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of the Lord." And he said to the people, "Proceed and march around the city, and let him who is armed advance before the ark of the Lord." So it was, when Joshua had spoken to the people, that the 7 priests bearing the 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the Lord advanced and blew the trumpets, and the ark of the covenant of the Lord followed them. The armed men went before the priest, who blew the trumpets, and the rear guard came after the ark, while the priest continued blowing the trumpets. So, they were blowing the trumpets every day, but the last day there's a special sound on the trumpet. Where was I at? Verse 9, I think. The armed men went before the priest, who blew the trumpets, and the rear guards came after the ark, while the priest continued blowing the trumpets. Now Joshua had commanded the people, saying, "You shall not shout," hear this, "or make any noise with your voice." So don't shout, don't talk, don't do anything. "Nor shall a word proceed out of your mouth until the day I tell you to shout, then you shall shout." So he had the ark of the Lord circle the city, going around it once. Then they set into camp and lodged in the camp. And Joshua rose early in the morning, and the priests took up the ark of the Lord. So every day they're doing this. Then 7 priests bearing 7 trumpets of ram's horn before the ark of the Lord went on continually and blew with the trumpets, and the armed men went before them. But the rear guard came after the ark of the Lord, while the priests continued blowing the trumpets. And the second day they marched around the city once and returned to camp. So they did for 6 days. So day after day, continually being obedient. And not just the soldiers being obedient, but the priests carrying the ark being obedient, and the priests who were blowing the trumpets being obedient. This is a grand procession. And I can imagine that the people inside of Jericho are starting to go from an awe of, like, what in the world is this, to almost an attitude of, these people are crazy, and there's no way that this is going to work, and what do they think is going to happen? And so rather than having, I believe they still had a fear of God, but they were really like, kind of, what is going on here, and how are these crazy people going to defeat us in battle? So it's really an amazing story. The ark is very prominent in this, as it was in the crossing over the Jordan. So it's very important for us, anytime we're in any kind of spiritual battle, that we are watching and looking for the presence of God, and we're seeking to have His presence with us and seeking after God. So it's very important that we do this. Any questions, comments so far? All right. So they're going around the city, and it's taking courage for them to do this. It's taking endurance. But one thing that we didn't talk about is that, imagine the helplessness that Israel might be feeling. So we're saying it's taking courage, it's taking endurance, but many times whenever we're totally dependent upon God, then we can feel kind of helpless in ourselves, right? And so we're seeing this, that every day they go out, it seems, can I tell you, I think God had them march around this city for 6 days before He did anything, so that they could see how great the city was, how impenetrable the walls was, and then they would understand the miraculous that God does in just knocking down the walls, and the people are able to go in and to defeat the city. So I think it's important that they begin to understand it's not us that's going to do this. This city is, and the walls are bigger than us, but we have a great big God, right? Who's able to do that. So very important. So let's read verse 15 and 16. We're going to talk about that. But it came to pass on the seventh day that they rose early about the dawning of the day and marched around the city 7 times in the same manner. Now, if you thought that the people of Jericho thought they were crazy on day 1 through 6, now on day 7, they're really going to think these people have lost their minds, right? And on that day, they marched around the city 7 times. And the 7th time it happened when the priests blew the trumpets that Joshua said to the people, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city." So over a period of 7 days, the Israelites are marching. Now, something that I don't have an answer for, but if they marched for 7 days, that means they had to have marched on a Sabbath, right? But they weren't being disobedient to the Lord because God told them to do it, right? Just to throw that in there. But we know that God gives grace whenever, in those circumstances. So they're told to shout to the Lord when Joshua tells them to shout. So 6 days of silence, and then they get to shout, right? And I believe that somehow, even though this is a really kind of a crazy strategy that God is using, when I'm not calling God crazy, in man's eyes, it seems crazy. I believe that every day God was doing something in the hearts of the Israelites that their faith was building. And so whenever they give this shout on the 7th day, I mean, it's just a release that they shout, and we see that they understand that the Lord has given them the city. Let's read verses 17 through 19. Now the city shall be doomed by the Lord to destruction, it and all who are in it. Only Rahab, remember the story of Rahab just a few weeks ago, the harlot shall live, she and all who are with her in the house, because she hid the messengers that we sent. And you, by all means, abstain from the accursed thing. Let me pause here. This is going to be very important for what we're going to talk about next week. All right? Abstain from the accursed things, lest you become accursed when you take of the accursed things and make the camp of Israel a curse and trouble it. So here, Joshua is giving them a warning. There are some things that he's already told them that you're not supposed to do, some things that you're not supposed to take. Remember, this is the first city. So essentially, if you're looking from God's standpoint, God's saying, this is going to be a tithe to me. All the spoil, all the everything, they're not to take it. They're not to touch certain things. So it's important that we understand that, because next week that's going to come into play. But all the silver and gold and vessels of bronze and iron are consecrated to the Lord. They shall come into the treasury of the Lord. So God's saying, this first city, now he doesn't tell them this every time. He's saying this first city, all the silver and the gold is to go to the treasury of the Lord, to the temple, however you want to look at that. But you're not to take anything. You're supposed to, go in and not destroy pretty much everything, with the exception of just taking the silver and gold to donate it into the treasury of the Lord. So look how faithful God is to Rahab. Just a simple act of obedience, of simply letting the 2 spies stay in her house and hiding them. And then God is faithful to her that she is able to be rescued. Have promised her, and she's put her faith in God. See, there's a difference between Rahab and the people of Jericho. Rahab heard about God, and while she was in fear, she put her trust in God and in the people of God. Whereas the people of Jericho were fearful of God and what was going to what was going to happen or what they thought was going to happen, yet they allowed that to turn their hearts and to harden them instead of uh, submitting to God. I believe, now this would be interesting, but I believe had all of Jericho repented and turned to God and done what they were supposed to, they could have been saved. But of course, we know that that doesn't happen. But Jericho is going to be defeated. So Joshua commands the people to stay away from the accursed thing. The idols are some of the things that they were supposed to stay away from, because one of the reasons why God was going to destroy this people of Jericho was because they were very evil people. And, they could have repented, but they did not. Just like Sodom and Gomorrah could have repented, but they did not. So there's lots of depravity that's going on in the city of Jericho. So God's bringing judgment against them because they didn't follow after God. They had an opportunity to. They could have. There's all kinds of things. They're in league with the occult, idols, all kinds of things. And so God is going to destroy them. But all the valuables are going to belong to God. So those are like first fruits. Have you heard the term first fruits whenever we talk about tithing? All the silver and the gold is going to be first fruits to the treasury of the Lord. All right. Any questions or comments up to this point? So lots going on. Verse 20 through 21. So the people shouted when the priest blew the trumpets, and it happened when the people heard the sound of the trumpet, and the people shouted with a great shout that the wall fell down flat. Wow. Now, we're not talking about a wall like here in the church. It's got a little bit of brick on the outside and some studs, although, I don't want to see that wall fall either. But we're talking about 20 feet thick walls and 20-something, probably 25 feet tall walls that fall totally flat just when the people shout unto the Lord. Of course, we know God did that. Then the people went up into the city, every man straight before him, and they took the city, and they utterly destroyed all that was in the city, both man and woman, young and old, ox and sheep, and donkey, with the edge of the sword. So they destroy everything, or at least it appears that they have. God's been faithful to him. The walls have fallen flat. The people obediently march into the city, and they're able to take Jericho. I believe that the people of Jericho were so stunned by what God had done that they were easily killed. They're easily defeated in battle. Yes, imagine, like Carol said, if a 20-foot wall, walls all the way around the city fall flat, the kind of reaction that the people would have. Plus, we know that God had already instilled fear in their heart. They're already defeated in their heart. It doesn't take that much when people are defeated in their heart and in their mind. So God is with them. Now, go ahead. Question. Yeah, I think many of them, as Donna said, and Bill was agreeing with, probably did die just from the walls falling and the impact of that. And when I think about it, I'm thinking, how did they save Rahab? Did they go get her before the walls fell? Her family, all of those. There's some unanswered questions here, but we do know that she's saved. But something here that we see is that God tells them to utterly destroy the city. And many times we look at this and we think, wow, that's a very harsh thing for God to say. And it does seem harsh, but at times we'll see God say he's going to have them do this, and then at other times he does different things. So this time he uses opportunity to judge the people. Uh, and I want to read something to you that comes from Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 9 through 14. And this is what the Lord tells them about the people of not just Jericho, but the people of the land, the promised land that God is going to give to them. This is why he tells them many times, you're to destroy everything. And the reason was because of God's judgment. So God tells them in Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 9 through 14, he says, when you come into the land which the Lord your God is giving you, you shall not learn to follow the abominations of those nations. So the issue was, if God was to allow the nations to continue to exist, that the children of Israel would be drawn into that kind of lifestyle. So that's why God is telling them not to do that. There shall not be found among you anyone who makes his son or daughter pass through the fire, or one who practices witchcraft, or a soothsayer, or one who interprets omens, or a sorcerer, or one who conjures spells, or a medium, or a spiritist. So you see that these people were not just bad people in a general sense, but they were doing all kinds of occult practices. They were burning their children alive. They were practicing the occult, all of these kinds of things. And that's why God's saying, look, cannot risk that you would pick up any of their ways. And so God has them to destroy them. For all who do these things, the Lord continues, are an abomination to the Lord, and because of the abominations, the Lord your God drives them out from before you. You shall be blameless before the Lord your God, for these nations which you will dispossess listen to soothsayers and diviners, but as for you, the Lord your God has not appointed you for such for you. So we see that God is using the children of Israel really in a judgment. And God had given these people years and years to repent and to change. And yet, when they still haven't. So God is casting judgment upon them. Let's read the verses 22 through 25. But Joshua had said to the two men who spied out the country, go into the harlot's house, and from there bring out the woman and all that she has, as you swore to her. And the young men who had been spies went in and brought out Rahab, her father, her mother, her brothers, and all that she had. So they brought out all her relatives and left them outside the camp of Israel. But they burned the city and all that was in it with fire. So this is like a sacrifice to the Lord. They're being obedient to God. They're showing their dedication to what God has told them to do. They burned the city. Only the silver and gold and the vessels of bronze and iron they put into the treasury of the house of the Lord. And Joshua spared Rahab the harlot, her father's household, and all that she had. So she dwells in Israel to this day, because she hid the messengers whom Joshua sent to spy out Jericho. So when you look at this, there's a couple of things there, or at least one thing that we need to notice, is that the book of Joshua was not written hundreds of years after it happened. It was written very soon after it happened, because it says that she's dwelling in Israel to this day, right, with Israel. So I'm taking an apologetics class, and one of the things that it tells you is that is important about the New Testament and about Scripture is that it can be authenticated by, it's not normally hundreds or thousands of years later that it's written in about, but just sometimes 20 or 30 years or less that those things are written about. So it's very important. This was written very soon after Jericho was defeated. So they burned the city, and Rahab is able to recover her family. How many remember the sign that they were supposed to see? The red cord in the window, right? Which is obviously symbolic of the blood of Christ. So They knew where to go to be able to save Rahab. Um, Something very interesting that happens. Let's read the last two verses. Then Joshua charged them at that time, saying, "Cursed be the man before the Lord who rises up and builds this city Jericho. He shall lay its foundation with his firstborn, and with his youngest he shall set up its gates." So the Lord was with Joshua, and his fame spread throughout all the country. So here at the defeat of Jericho, Joshua prophesies forward, I don't remember how many years now, a lot of years, to say that when Jericho is rebuilt, that it will take the life of the man's oldest and youngest son, right? To be able to rebuild Jericho. And you see that in 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 34. It says this: "In his days, Hiel of Bethel built Jericho. He laid its foundation with Abiram his firstborn, and with his youngest son, Segub, he set up its gates according to the word of the Lord, which he had spoken through Joshua the son of Nun." So we see that Joshua's, I'm going to call it prophecy, his prediction that it was going to take a lot to rebuild the city. So this is the first battle in the Promised Land. And God does some amazing things. I think God does it in such fashion that the other people, the other nations, are going to continue to be afraid. They're going to continue to be fearful of God. But also, it helps the Israelites to gain even more faith in God, to see what's God's going to do. So it's very important. So they have to have faith, they have to have obedience, they have to have courage and endurance, and they have to rely on God's method of doing things. Imagine, we look at this and we think, oh, okay, it seems very commonplace to us, but if your life was in jeopardy, how easy would it be for you to follow God and to be totally obedient to Him? Maybe easier than we think because they saw what God was doing, but still, it would require some total faith and trust in the Lord. All right. Any questions or comments tonight? Yes, it was the first battle inside the Promised Land. They had defeated some kings and taken some territory on the east side of the Jordan, but I believe that's correct. I don't know if it's east or west, but I believe it's east. They had already taken some land there. As a matter of fact, 2.5 of the tribes, once all of the battle for the territory is over with, they want to go back across the Jordan. So, it's kind of like a tithe, to the Lord. Got any other questions? Well, let's go through the questions that I have here for you, and they may spur you to make some comments. What a fantastic story. I remember being told this whenever I was in children's church as a little kid, and how we acted it out and did all those things. So it's just an amazing thing that happened. So question number 1, what did God say concerning Jericho in verse 2? I have given Jericho into your hand. So what we noted about that was that it was not I will give, but past tense, I already have. In God's mind, it was said and done, right? Question number 2, what did Joshua instruct the people to do in verse 7? March around the city, and whoever is armed go before the ark, right? So they're to be obedient and to march around the city. Question number 3, what specific commands were given to the priests? Well, the priests, these are the seven priests, I guess I should say. What specific commands? That's from verse 8. That's correct. So they're to blow the ram's horns, and the ark followed them. So they were being obedient to the Lord. The horn was used to assemble the people, but also used in battle. So it was like a sign that though it may not look like battle and we're just marching around, it was symbolic that there was spiritual battle that was about to happen. God was getting ready to move. Question number 4. Joshua declared that everything in Jericho was to be dedicated to the Lord. Explain what would happen if this was not obeyed, according to verse 18. They would be accursed. They would be accursed, let me say this, singularly, and then as the whole camp of Israel. So what one did would affect the whole camp of Israel. So it's very important that you see that. That's going to come into play next week. Question number 5. Who were the only people spared, according to verse 22 and 23? Father, mother, brothers, all that she had. Her kindred, yeah. Imagine if you were told that whoever is in your house is going to be saved. Would you leave out any cousins or any? If you didn't like them, you might. That's funny. But the command was whoever she had in her household. And really, I think that speaks to the promises of God, that God is a God of that He saves households. And we can put our trust in God to save our households if we're faithful to Him. So it's interesting. I think her house was probably packed with a lot of people, her family. Question number 6. As a sign of dedicating Jericho to the Lord, what did the Israelites do according to verse 24? They burned the city and put the silver and gold into the treasury of the temple. So they were dedicating all of that to the Lord. And then the last question, God is faithful to do what He tells to Joshua. As a result of his glorious victory, where did Joshua's fame spread? Throughout all the country. So God honored what He told to Joshua, that He would cause him to be looked upon in the same way that Moses was, that He would exalt him in the eyes of the people. And this isn't meant to like a prideful thing, but think about it. If you're going into battle, you don't want people questioning the authority of the captain, right? Or of the leader. So it's very important that God is exalting Joshua in the eyes of the people so that they will follow him and they won't question and they'll be obedient. I've never been in the military, was not a part of the military, but I do know this, is that the people that they train in the military are trained to the point that they do not question what their authorities tell them to do. And the reason is that if you're in a battle and your captain tells you to go this direction and you don't do it and you go the opposite direction, you're probably going to get killed. It's for your safety. So it was not just a matter of pride that God would exalt Joshua, but so that the people would put their trust in him, that God was talking to him and able to lead them. So very important in that. All right. That's very true. Carol was talking about Rahab, and I'm sure she definitely went to her family and said, look, I've got this promise from the spies that if we'll be together and in my house, that they'll save everyone who is in my house. And it is very possible that some would say, I don't believe that. That's just a setup, or not trust. But sometimes even when we go to our families, they don't listen to what the Lord has told us, that He is a God who will come back, and He is coming back for His children, and so they need to be ready. Amen. So, good point. I hadn't seen that in there. Right. Any other comments? Well, praise the Lord. Thank you for joining us tonight. For those who are sitting here, if you would like to, if you have any special prayer requests, we can do that. And thank you for those who have joined us. If you do have any prayer requests and you want to put that in the comments, we will be looking at that. So God bless you and keep you and cause His face to shine upon you and give you peace. Amen.